during the debate, I brought up Bret Weinstein. Bret Weinstein is an evolutionary biologist who speaks about the importance of religion in terms of adaptationism. Now, what's interesting is that I knew Alex was going to bring up Bret Weinstein because he actually brought him up in his initial video. So I looked up, some of the things that Bret Weinstein's been saying, and in fact, Alex used him for something different to what I used him for. Alex was just using him for the idea of metaphorical truth, right? So truth as a metaphor, truth as something useful, useful fictions essentially. Now, the funny thing is that I brought him up in terms of religion being adaptive, and in terms of the argument, which I just changed the variables in his argument, that if we just, there you go, you can hear us. If we just make religion a way of attaining pleasure, which for many people it is, then to maximize pleasure, we can basically end up believing in God. Now, when I actually said this to Alex, obviously I'm going to play the clip now where he, responded to that. The funny thing is, he first tried to challenge it, which I found kind of indefensible, which eventually had to concede, no, there's nothing wrong with doing that. But why I used him is firstly because if he's referencing Bret in terms of one context and I use him in another context, then it's more embarrassing. So that's one of the reasons why I actually decided to use Bret Weinstein. The second thing is I wanted to show the absurdity of his argument, because atheists are all about, we're rational people, we're skeptical, we are free thinkers, we're brights, we're this, we're that. So when you show them that your argument, which you're putting forward, which to be honest is unique to Alex because it's his argument, is leading to this conclusion, that is quite funny, because it just completely undermines their whole ethos, their whole rationality, because for them, they see God as something absurd. So when their argument leads to that logical conclusion, then it's basically very difficult to defend, and it's also very unpleasant, because it's just something which they don't want to admit. Anyway, I'm going to play the clip now and give a few more thoughts about what actually had transpired. Now, 5 minutes. 5 minutes, okay. Now, another thing that Alex mentioned is Bret Weinstein's idea of metaphorical truths. Now, what I want to do is, I thought this was quite interesting when you mentioned Bret Weinstein, because Bret Weinstein says a lot more than just the idea that of the loaded gun and this idea of metaphorical truth. He's an evolutionary biologist who actually believes religion is adaptive. And if we take Alex's argument and we not challenge it, we don't actually challenge it, we simply change the variables. We take Alex's argument and we change the variables. He's trying to maximize pleasure, right? And you have to be philosophically consistent with your worldview. Well, in that case, according to studies, including the person that you referenced, Bret Weinstein, religion reduces stress, increases life, increases reproductive success, increases social cohesion. Now we can go over the studies in which belief in God does this thing, makes you less depressed and so whatnot. So if we insert that new variable into Alex's argument, then essentially we will have billions of atheists who will overnight become into Jordan Petersons. They'll pretend as if God exists to maximize pleasure. Right?
I would argue there's a simple way of reconciling the correct understanding that religious belief often describes truths that in many cases fly in the face of what we can understand scientifically, with the idea that these beliefs are adaptive. I call it the state of being literally false and metaphorically true. A belief is literally false and metaphorically true if it is not factual, but if behaving as if it were factual results in an enhancement of one's fitness. To take an example, if one behaves in, let's say, the Christian tradition in such a way as to gain access to heaven, one will not actually find themselves at the pearly gates being welcomed in, but one does tend to place their descendants in a good position with respect to the community that those descendants continue to live in. So if we were to think evolutionarily, the person who is behaving so as to get into heaven has genetic interests. Those genetic interests are represented in the narrow sense by their immediate descendants and close relatives. In the larger sense, they may be represented by the entire population of people from whom that individual came. And by acting so as to get into heaven, the fitness of that person, the number of copies of those genes that continue to flourish in the aftermath of that person's death will go up. So the belief in heaven is literally false. There is no such place. But it is metaphorically true in the sense that it results in an increase in fitness.
I think I should begin on the point about Bret Weinstein believing religion to be adaptive and beneficial. I'm perfectly aware. I've seen him argue it myself. But as in the same way that I might appeal to the Benthamite principle that pain and pleasure are our sovereign masters, even though he may have said that rights are nonsense and that natural rights are nonsense on still, I can reference a person's idea without taking what they're saying wholesale, but also the idea that, on this worldview that I'm promoting, if religion is adaptive, which, I don't know if it is, I'm willing to grant it for the sake of discussion, that I'd be committed to a worldview that says that atheists would be continually pretending as though religion exists. I'm wondering if the audience remembers when I issued a throat clearing that said that that's precisely not what I'm doing with human rights. And I even said by name that I'm not saying that human rights do not exist and we just pretend as though they do, but just clarifying the nature of their existence.
So if I take your argument and I input the new variable of God, why would that be incorrect?
Well, I'm not sure it would be, but I'm just arguing that as an atheist, it's coherent to
How
believe in
could
the
it be
concept of human
coherent
rights.
if we grant that religion is adaptive, right?
Yeah.
Belief in God is adaptive. According to your argument, shouldn't we therefore, to maximize pleasure, believe in God?
Well, it depends what you mean. So this is the thing. When we say that the existence of God, when we're discussing whether or not God exists, we are talking about something more metaphysical. We're talking about we're not talking about the existence of a concept or a method to maximizing pleasure. When we're arguing about the existence of God, we're arguing about whether or not something is true. We're arguing about human rights. We're arguing about a method and a concept.
I think you misunderstand what I'm trying to do. What I'm doing is I'm taking your argument.
Yeah.
I'm not challenging it. I'm just changing the variables.
I see.
So, maximizing pleasure,
Yeah.
right? Belief in God reduces stress, makes you less depressed, and increases reproductive success and so on, like Bret Weinstein mentions. Then why shouldn't we just pretend as if there is a God just to maximize pleasure?
For a number of reasons. Firstly, I'm not sure I agree with Bret Weinstein on his diagnosis there.
You deny the premise.
Deny the premise.
You deny that religion is adaptive.
But well, I think I'm capable of denying that. I'm just saying that
No,
that's,
I'm just questioning
that's one thing that can be taken. I mean, I don't know. I don't know
Sure.
if it's adaptive or not. But also, I think it's a category error that you're making. I don't think that you can swap them in that respect, right? If I talk about human rights as being something which are beneficial to achieving a moral end that does actually exist, I'm not saying that anything that is beneficial to believe exists can be placed in there. I'm saying
Why
that
not?
Human rights is of a specific category, that they exist as a concept by definition. That's what they are. That's the nature of a human right. It's a moral mechanism. It's not something that tangibly exists in the way that a God would.
Yeah, I'm not challenging that. I'm saying that's fine.
So you can't swap them for that
No,
reason.
no.
Right?
You see, what you're doing is this, right? You're misunderstanding what I'm trying to do. I'm simply saying, if we just take the structure of your argument and we assume, because you may not agree with it. I have some studies here which we can discuss. If we assume that belief in God does have these adaptive benefits and it does lead to maximization of pleasure, then why don't we just simply believe in God?
I've got no problem with saying if people think that it's going to maximize pleasure to act as though God exists in some vague sense, and so do so for that reason.
But then there'll be no atheists to believe in human rights.
Only if it is actually true.
Yeah.
That religion is adaptive,
Yeah.
and that these people don't, and that these people specifically place a value,
so this is where I'd like to,
and that these people specifically place a value,
sure,
not on the knowledge of truth. Because to say to someone when talking about human rights that human rights don't tangibly exist, that's not a problem for them. They're not going to mind that because that's not what they think human rights are anyway. Whereas with religion, I think that if you say, well, look, God is beneficial to you, but doesn't actually exist, I think that's going to be more troublesome to the religious believer. Someone's not going to be able to believe in the same way.
I'm not making an argument for God. I was just showing.
No, I know you're not. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just showing if this premise is this is what we're going to discuss now. So I could cite studies where there is this benefit. Recently, Pew put out this research that belief in God makes you happier, and so on and so forth. So if that is granted, then that conclusion is valid.
What conclusion?
The conclusion that we'd have to pretend as if God exists.
No, because again, this is what I think that you're missing here, is that these are two different types of thing, right? Religion, the existence of God, are metaphysical truth claims.
Yes.
Human rights
Yes,
are a
but
moral
look,
tool.
What I'm doing here is I'm only changing the variables in your argument. And
But you're changing them in such a way that can't be done, right? Like you
Why?
can't just swap in something that isn't of the same category.
Why not?
I mean, I don't. I mean, I hope that much.
Okay, so
would be
look,
clear.
do you believe, for example, you don't believe ontologically morals exist?
I mean, what is that? What do you mean by that? You mean
so,
as in,
so in your previous video,
like talking about human rights or something, as in principles existing as something tangible in nature somehow? Then no.
No. Okay. So for the sake of a better society, we can believe in these morals, right?
But that's not that. There's not a case of pretending as though they exist even.
Fine.
though they don't.
Fine. For you.
Yeah.
Right. But what's wrong with us just doing that with God, just to maximize pleasure?
Nothing.
Nothing. That's the point.
Yeah, you can
that's
do,
the point.
You
It's
can
nothing.
do that if you like.
Yeah.
But
so my point. As you can see, he first tried to fight off that idea. He tried to say, no. We don't have to accept the idea of God. God's in a different category. But that was an irrelevant difference. It was a difference, but it was irrelevant. Anyway, finally he conceded to that. However, the idea, when he tried to deny the premise of religion being adaptive, religion leading to that type of pleasure, I want you guys to realize how big of a mistake that actually was. The reason for that being a big mistake is because the literature to show that religion is actually adaptive is quite substantial. Now, of course, there's a counter argument that it's not, but I just wanted to highlight that if we are to take the Darwinian picture to be true, then you have to take those arguments seriously. Now, if you don't take the Darwinian literature true, then you have a grounding to actually challenge the adaptive origin of religion story seriously, which I've done previously in one of my lectures, which you can see on this channel, called Islam Under the Darwinian Lens. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight just how far Alex is actually going from evolutionary biology when he tried to challenge the premise that religion is actually adaptive. I hope you guys are enjoying these series of post-debate analyses.